Let's go ahead and talk about, what's on everybody's minds, and I'd like to welcome out our esteemed panelists. Come on out. We have this morning. Hey, Chris.
How you doing?
Hi. This morning we have some people who are some of the nation's foremost experts on healthcare reform. Seated directly to my right is Chris Condalucci, Principal for CC Law and Policy. I've known Chris for a number of years, and we've traveled the circuit on Capitol Hill and in Washington, D.C. together. He was actually on the Senate Finance Committee during the drafting of the original Affordable Care Act and has a deep, as a policy analyst, and has a deep knowledge of healthcare reform in general. Seated next to him is Kristen Lewis, a good friend of ours from Equifax. She's a Senior Director of Product Management for Equifax's award-winning employer compliance suite of products. And seated next to her is Jody Deedle, who's she's the Chief Compliance Officer for WageWorks, another great partner of ours, and has spent her career advocating on behalf of consumers over compliance and healthcare consumerism. So we wanted to, we have a lot to talk about, and we wanted to go ahead and get started with the question that's on everybody's mind. If we can. All right, well, so anyway, the question that's on everybody's mind is who we are, and
there we go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Pretty appropriate, huh? So what just happened? We'll talk about that later. But this is really what is going on with healthcare reform. We're less than 60 days into the new presidential administration, and I would ask that people keep an eye on Twitter to make sure that everything that we say is current about healthcare reform while we're talking. But we really just wanted to get right down to it and figure out what is the process, what is it that we're talking about, the American Healthcare Act, what does it mean? What does it mean for the Affordable Care Act? And I wanted to start with you, Chris. Just tell us a little bit. You almost literally live on Capitol Hill and you spend a great deal of time there. Tell us about the process and the procedures and everything that's going on right now.
Yeah, it's an interesting process and a crazy one, to say the least. And there's so much noise out there, right? There's so much headlines that you see and so much speculation and so much rhetoric and discussion on one side as well as the other. And I really like to personally, when I talk to clients or I talk to an audience like this, to really kind of cut through the noise and try to explain, what the process is and kind of why we are where we are. When it comes to process, right, there are two ways that you can repeal and replace the ACA. The first way is through the normal legislative process. Now, through the normal legislative process, you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass any piece of legislation. Republicans right now only have 52 seats. They're not about to get 8 Democrats to join them in repealing and replacing the ACA, so you're not going to be able to repeal and replace the ACA through the normal legislative process. There's another option, however, and it's called the reconciliation process. And I'm sure that you've heard this word, you might have read an explanation of it through some print media, or you might have heard some explanations over some of the TV, different talk shows. In short, the reconciliation process does allow legislation to be passed by just 51 votes. So the 60-vote threshold that I mentioned is not applicable. But in order to get the luxury, as I like to refer to it, of getting this 51-vote threshold for passage of legislation, there's conditions and there's constraints on what can be included in this underlying legislation. And those conditions are the provisions can only impact spending and they can only impact taxes. And now that's a really important piece of information for everybody to understand, because it tells you that only portions of the ACA can be repealed and replaced through this reconciliation process: taxes and spending. And again, that's really important to understand, because while the taxes like the Cadillac tax will be impacted, the employer mandate will be repealed, the individual mandate will be repealed, the contribution limit on FSAs, all of the taxes under the ACA can be repealed. Also, spending side, Medicaid expansion, the premium subsidies in the individual market, that could be repealed as well. But guess what cannot be repealed? The insurance market reforms. So reforms like the pre-X prohibition, the coverage of adult children up to age 26, the no cost sharing for preventive service, the no annual and lifetime limits. All of those provisions that apply to group health plans, for example, will not be repealed through this recent reconciliation process that Republicans are trying to pass their legislation through. So with that, a little bit of process, let me turn it back to you to see if you have another question relating to what's going on now.
Yeah, you know, I think that the one thing to note, just a sort of historical tidbit, is that the reconciliation process is actually how the Affordable Care Act was passed to begin with, because the Democrats didn't have the votes at the time after the 2010 election to get it passed. And so it's a similar process, but there are many, you know, ramifications of that. And I think that, you know, one thing that we look at, we're a room full of employers, and there is a great need for reporting. And so one of the key questions is, what happens to reporting if the AHCA passes? And even if the AHCA doesn't pass. So Kristen, tell us, you know, Equifax has been providing, you know, reporting services since, you know, the beginning of the Affordable Care Act. What do you guys see as some of the ramifications of what's happening right now on those, that area?
Yeah, great question. You know, the big three things that the current reporting in its current state do today is they allow the IRS to really enforce the employer mandate, so determine whether an employer owes penalties under the shared responsibility rules. The forms are also used to enforce the individual mandate, so to make sure that Kristen had coverage consistently throughout the year. And the third thing is they're also used to reconcile the tax credits or subsidies that an individual may have received earlier in the year. So as we look at what's happening with the American Health Care Act, it's very clear that the budget reconciliation process can and likely will be used to eliminate the individual and employer mandates, right, or at least the penalties associated with those. So if you think about the three things that reporting is doing today, AHCA sort of strikes out 2 out of the 3, right? But under the new plan, individuals are still going to be able to apply for tax credits through the federal government, and a component of that eligibility for a tax credit is going to be, did you have access to coverage through your employer? So the way Equifax looks at it is, there's always going to be, or there's very likely always going to be some component of employer reporting that needs to happen, really tied to helping the government reconcile whether they made an appropriate or valid payment to an individual who may have applied for a tax credit. So I think maybe the light at the end of the tunnel for some employers is it's very likely that in 2020, when we have sort of the new form of tax credits, the complexity of reporting will almost certainly go down. They just don't need as much information since they don't have to enforce certain aspects of the penalties. But whether they use the Form W-2, which is sort of what they're alluding to today, or whether there's some other kind of simplified avenue, I think that's what we're anticipating when we hit that 2020 milestone.
Right, right. And there are some, you know, a lot of the reporting was kind of hammered out for the Affordable Care Act, was really hammered out in regulatory updates as well. So, and that's another area that we'll see a lot of focus in the coming years. And in fact, there are things that are in the AHCA that kind of point to the continued need for reporting of some kind on the employer side. So, Jody, as I mentioned, you've been an advocate on Capitol Hill and throughout the country for consumerism and compliance issues for many, many years. And there, with the American Health Care Act and with the you know, Republican stance in general on healthcare reform, there are some, you know, pretty significant you know, hints toward continued healthcare consumerism and continued or increased focus on employer-based benefits. Tell us a little bit about some of those and how you guys view it.
Yeah, I think we feel very good about the American Health Care Act with respect to how they treat consumer-directed health care. Particularly, the Republicans have a long-standing policy to really improve and expand health savings accounts. And so you're seeing a lot of you know, virtually anything, any provision they can get through the Byrd rule, which is what Chris was referring to with the reconciliation process, they're trying to do. So things already were mentioned. The prescription requirement for over-the-counter drugs is in the bill to be repealed. Health savings account limits will be increased to match the out-of-pocket maximums that are in place. That's a great thing. You'll be able to fund your entire risk. Repealing the limit on flexible spending accounts, for example, is another good thing. So I think there's just a growing understanding on the part of Republicans that, first of all, out-of-pocket costs are here, right, and they continue to rise, and employees really need these tools to be able to budget for and withstand, these rising out-of-pocket expenses.
Yeah. And absolutely, that's something that's been an ongoing focus of ours as well. We heard Shan, our CEO, on Tuesday in our keynote talk about the effects of ongoing regulatory change, and sort of it's a continuum as opposed to like, oh my goodness, this is just happening now. We all know that compliance is a very heavy concern, but we also know, and we've heard from our customers time and again, that cost and complexity and consumerism are key drivers as well. So seeing how these things will coincide and what the sort of the look forward is very valuable. Chris, let's go back and talk about some of the fundamentals of and maybe some of the differences in what we've seen over the past several years versus what we see in the Republican proposals, and then after that, I'd like to get into a little bit of the sort of the horse race, I guess, and we can talk a little bit about what are the prospects for this actually happening.
Yeah. And I did want to touch on that. My beginning remarks is I didn't want everyone's eyes to glaze over when I'm talking about 60 votes versus 51 votes. People are like, what the heck is that? But again, baby steps. So I explained to you a little bit about the process and what can be done through reconciliation process and what cannot, and obviously what can't and cannot be done through the normal legislative process. But before I get to the horse race, picking up on Jody's point, Republicans have always favored moving in the direction of consumer-driven health type arrangements. So they want to pursue policies to promote the continued movement toward consumer-driven health. And Republicans also, just the Republican orthodoxy is, we want to get out of the way. We want to get out of the way of the marketplace. If the marketplace is moving toward consumer-driven health, for example, let's get out of the way, but if there's ways that we could put the thumb on the scale to, let's say, promote certain activities or certain behavioral changes, we're going to go ahead and do that. And one of the, I'd say, core components of this recent repeal and replace reconciliation bill, which I'll get into more detail in a second, one core component of is expanding health savings accounts. Jody alluded to some of it, but just some of the particulars of the expansion of HSAs is they're increasing the contribution limit from where it is now up to the out-of-pocket maximum limitation. And the theory there is if you allow employers and employees to contribute all the way up to the max of the out-of-pocket limits, then that employee or that consumer, even in the individual market that has an HSA, will be able to utilize those dollars to pay for the out-of-pocket expenses. So it's almost providing parity between the deductible or the cost sharing associated with the high deductible health plan with the pot of money that is supposed to be there to pay for the out-of-pocket expenses in the form of the HSA dollars. So that's the theory behind why Republicans, that is, are increasing contribution limits in HSAs. Another provision for HSA expansion is allowing spouses to make catch-up contributions to the same HSA. Really, under the current law right now, it's kind of screwy. If and I'll even bring your book up about marriage. Sometimes,
Please do.
Sometimes
Amazon.
when you're a husband and wife, you want to do things separately. You want things separate. Well, when you have an HSA and the HSA rules, they require the spouses to have separate HSAs. So if you want to contribute a catch-up contribution to your HSA, you can only contribute to spouse males HSA and female HSA. You can't combine those contributions. Well, this change in the law would recognize the screwy nature of this particular rule under the current HSA rules and allow spouses to contribute to the same HSA, making their catch-up contributions. The other one is dealing with paying for expenses that are incurred prior to the establishment of an HSA. Again, it's just a recognition of, hey, you're under a high deductible health plan. You might not be aware that you are HSA eligible, but then let's say you incur a medical expense that's pretty significant. You can set up an HSA after the fact, pull money out of that HSA on a tax-free basis. So that, again, is trying to promote the use of HSAs, the movement toward high deductible health plans, trying to get employers to contribute more money on behalf of their employees, and that hopefully provides some seed money for the employees to then encourage them to contribute, and then you're in the perfect world of a pot of money to pay for out-of-pocket expenses. So that's a little bit of just one example of where Republicans want to go, keying off of the consumer-driven health movement or the promotion of policies in that direction. With regard to the, let's say, the horse race or the rat race, as maybe I'll refer to it, and I'll close on this. On March 6th, the contents of a repeal/replace reconciliation bill was unveiled. So we now essentially know what is in the American Health Care Act. The House Ways and Means and the House Energy and Commerce Committee last week favorably approved this legislation. Actually today, this morning, the House Budget Committee will consider the same piece of legislation. There'll be some modifications made to it, but not significantly. And what are the contents of the repeal, replace reconciliation bill that you guys should care about? One, I told you about the HSAs expansion. Kristen spoke about reporting, and reporting repeal is not in the underlying bill. So the bill does not repeal the reporting requirements. In addition, the law continues the premium subsidies for a period of years. And as Kristen described, one component of the reporting requirements is to help the IRS determine premium subsidy eligibility. So if the premium subsidies are going to be around, the reporting requirements need to be around, even though the employer mandate might be going away. So that's another aspect of the bill. Lastly, there was a provision, as many of you may know, to limit the tax preference on employer-sponsored insurance, which I'm going to call the exclusion. So there was a direct limitation placed in the exclusion in a previous draft of this repeal, replace reconciliation bill. Well, that was pulled out when the final draft was unveiled. And it was pulled out because the employer community and the labor community did a fantastic job of pressuring members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, to say, no, we don't want that to be in the underlying bill. But when you pulled that direct limitation out, what happened was the Cadillac tax. Instead of full repeal of the Cadillac tax, these reconciliation rules that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk actually prevented full repeal of the Cadillac tax. So instead, the Cadillac tax is simply delayed until 2025 because utilizing this reconciliation process, certain rules prevent full repeal of the Cadillac tax. And we can get into more detail on that if you would like, but I don't want to bore you any further than I already have. So with that, I will turn it back to Shan.
Sure. And we've talked about the Cadillac tax. I've done this at some of our One Place local events, and I'm just curious, by a show of hands, employers in the audience, how many of you have changed plans or somehow, before there was a delay, somehow took moves to prepare yourselves for the Cadillac tax? All right, so yeah, about a third. That's usually where it is. It's usually somewhere between a third and a quarter. And that's something that we see. I remember, Chris, we were up on Capitol Hill about a year and a half ago before the Cadillac tax, just before the Cadillac tax got delayed. And it was a fever pitch. It was really intense. And we didn't, and what we were feeling from our customers, and Kristen, I think you probably felt this too, was the immediate concern is getting the reporting right. Mm-hmm. The Cadillac tax is this thing that's kind of out there a little bit, but our immediate concern was getting the reporting right. And that's, I think, something that we've, that we're always striving to do is what are the customer concerns in the immediate, in the, the absolute present, and then what's down the line there. So I want to play devil's advocate for a minute, and which is actually just me being myself probably, but and say, what's the point? what's the point of repeal and replace? If you look at the Affordable Care Act, you could, there are definitely problems in the individual market. There were dire predictions made about employer-based coverage. They didn't come true. In fact, employer-based coverage went up. The cost curve has, and we can argue all day about whether it's because of the Affordable Care Act or other measures, the cost curve did start to trend downward a little bit. There are a lot of anecdotal stories about people, being covered. The Affordable Care Act is still not, universally accepted, but it's at its highest popularity now that they're talking about repeal. So why do it? What's what's driving it, and does it matter?
Well,
anybody who wants to take that?
I'll take it, Boy. I think that the political climate drives a lot of it, and some of you were in our discussion yesterday about kind of the political climate and HSAs. I think, clearly Republicans have run for 7 years on repeal. So I don't think there's any choice. I think they have to do it. And I think the message to Democrats is, and you've seen it, even the Republican conservatives are calling this Obamacare light, right? The Republican bill. And I think the reality is this could be a messaging exercise, right? If you look at the things that have, because maybe they're not allowed to be in the reconciliation bill because of the Byrd rule that Chris has alluded to, Byrd rules, I think Democrats have an opportunity to say, look, we're fixing the things that need fixing, right? And there's a lot of things that we need to keep in mind as we talk about the American Health Care Act or the ACA. And the reality is that the issue is covering those that are uninsured. The Affordable Care Act didn't get there. I mean, there's still, 8 million people that don't, that are required by law to have coverage and choose not to. That's an important thing to remember. The employer market covers 178 million people. The individual and exchange market covers about 17. So what all this hubbub is 17 million Americans, and I'm for, it's not very many people. So we're spending all this money and time and effort on a very small segment, an important segment, but to some extent, and last week I was with the U.S. Chamber and American Benefits Council and HSA Council, and they made a really important point. It's like the employer market's doing fine. Why don't you leave us, don't mess with us, right?
And let me pick up on that too, because one allows me to get back to the horse race question, but almost on the why. From a horse race perspective, I mentioned to you that the contents of the bill were released on March 6th. The respective committees in the House of Representatives have acted already, and that is setting the stage for a full vote on the House floor, which will likely occur at the end of this month. Once the House passes its version of this reconciliation bill, it'll go over to the Senate. And let's just assume for a moment the Senate doesn't change that bill at all. And let's say they have the votes. Let's say they have 51 votes or 50 votes, and Vice President Pence comes up and breaks the tie such that it's 51 votes. Then we could actually see this law, or this bill that is, being signed by the president by mid-April. So we will know whether this law is actually going to be enacted or not, probably by the beginning of April. So that's from a timing perspective for you to understand. Now, from the why, Jody touched on it. It really is driven by politics. Again, as we all know, and you guys have all heard, annoyingly so, from my personal perspective, when you continue to hear this repeal and replace Obamacare, failure is not an option for Republicans. And this goes back to the horse race and this reconciliation process. There is a drop-dead date on which this reconciliation bill needs to be passed, or Republicans lose the opportunity to use this reconciliation process for repeal and replace of the ACA. And that drop-dead date is at the end of April. And if Republicans for the past 7 years have said we need to repeal and replace Obamacare, and they fail to do it, their base is going to kill them. Mm-hmm. And then you have Trump voters who probably aren't Republicans anyway, who already view congressional Republicans as weak, are going to view congressional Republicans as weak if they can't do it. So therefore, Republican leadership is taking in all of these factors, right, their decision-making process, and they're saying, we're going to dare some of the folks that have been more outspoken of late, saying we're not going to vote for this bill, because if they vote no, it's on them. The fact that the law was not repealed and replaced is on them, and leadership knows that, which really just goes back to the political side of this, the political strategy, the jockeying that goes on Capitol Hill. But the bottom line is, from my perspective, for Republicans at least, failure for them is not an option.
Right. And in the spirit, I was up late last night doing my brackets for the NCAA tournament. And in that spirit, and this is not a Benefitfocus sanctioned event that I'm about to do, but I would like to bet $1 to anybody that we won't see something pass by the end of April. That's my bet, is that we're not going to see it pass.
I'll take that bet.
Okay, all right.
I will take that.
There you
bet.
go. I do think that, it's phenomenal. I've used this, so I studied political science in college, and I was thinking about really during the election, this thought entered my mind that this past year, this past 18 months, being interested in politics has been like being a weatherman covering a hurricane. It's like you're so, like Jim Cantor, you're so excited and everything is terrible, It's just like destruction everywhere, but you're like, oh my God, this is so exciting. So it's a real kind of, juxtaposition of feelings there. But Kristen, I wanted to talk to you because your Equifax has really been on the front lines of adjusting to new realities of compliance and reform. But in conversations we've had, I think that it's about much more than just compliance and the letter of the law. There are other factors here. Consumerism really draws into it. So what are you hearing from customers right now, and what are you advising customers?
A lot of our customers, and Equifax supports a lot of very large employers who will always have in the back of their mind this fear of, I don't want to be the company that gets the really big PR backlash if we decide that if these penalties go away, we're no longer going to offer coverage to our full-time employees. So I think there's a theme that we're seeing from the employer community, and it's we're just going to keep our head down until this is all done. We want to know what, the speculation doesn't really give employers enough material to change their strategy. Right. That could create a lot of kind of whiplash among the employees that work for those employers. If they were to change their benefit plans and sort of communicate that in anticipation of these mandates going away, I don't think, we're not seeing anybody do that at all. There is some sort of thoughtful conversation around, this concept of if affordability goes away, right? If employers are no longer required to offer affordable coverage, but yet that very offer itself is going to preclude their employees from getting access to coverage through the exchanges in the future, I think there's this more strategic thought process going on among employers of, well, what's best for the employee then in that paradigm, right? Is it better to not offer coverage to employees of a certain maybe income level or age bracket because they may be able to get more affordable coverage through the exchange under the new tax credit laws? So I think, again, it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out and how that impacts how employers start to slowly sort of extract themselves from this very regulated rule set around who you have to offer coverage to and what it has to cost. But I think one theme that, again, we're seeing across the boards is employers generally, they really do want to do right by their employees, and they want to understand that full context of not just how this new act could impact them, but how their reaction to it could impact the individuals that work for them.
Right.
And I think to play into that, I think employers are starting to think about it. However, the individual market and the exchange market plans, are vastly different than most employer plans, and so there's a very, very thoughtful and analytical process that needs to take place for those employers as they, yes, their employees might be able to get less expensive coverage because they're going to get premium tax credits or refundable tax credits, but the reality is they might have larger deductibles, greater out-of-pocket cost sharing, because or access to even fewer, narrower networks, right? So I think that it's I see lots of nods in the audience. So I think that you really need to get really good outside counsel and advice from people when you're looking at some of those kind of seismic shifts, really, in employer-provided coverage.
Yeah.
And here's a prediction, and maybe I'll even go so far as to throw down
Do I need to get another dollar
a
out?
bet on this. Yeah, because I don't have one, so I'm going to have to write you an IOU. But my prediction, so Kristen alluded to, well, one, reporting is a big deal. And Kristen spoke a lot of the detail of reporting under current law, what reporting could be, should there be this replace world. And my prediction is relating to this if there ever is a replace world. So come 2020, take a step back. This law, this bill, should it be enacted mid-April, says come 2020, there's going to be a tax credit available in the individual market. We've established that, right? And Republicans want it to be as simple as possible. And it's going to be a fixed amount. It's going to only vary by age. It's not going to vary by income. So that's going to be very easy for the IRS to determine who's eligible and who's not. And again, the eligibility criteria is pretty limited as well. And the big one is if you are offered an employer plan, you are not eligible for this tax credit. And the manner in which the legislation right now suggests that employers report on that is by reporting on the Form W-2. Now, my prediction is today in the Budget Committee, when they mark up this reconciliation bill, there's going to be a change to the tax credit structure. They are going to base it on income because there's a recognition that lower income folks need additional financial assistance for health insurance in this individual market. And the reason why that's important is you're going to add now a layer of complexity from an eligibility determination if you're basing it on income. Mm-hmm. And as the tax credit gets more and more complex, the reporting requirements are going to get more and more complex. So even though staff just wants the employer to check a box on a W-2 to signify whether an employee is getting an offer or not, it's likely not going to come to fruition where it's just going to be that W-2 box check. Instead, it's going to be something more like the 1094, 1095s. Mm-hmm. And that, to conclude, is my prediction and my bet that we see complex reporting requirements, maybe a little bit less complex than the current ones, but they're still going to be much more complex than staff is currently contemplating.
Yeah, I would support that bet. And going back to the politics of it all, I mean, the Republicans have spent a lot of time and energy sort of criticizing and critiquing the fact that today's system of verifying eligibility for a subsidy has a lot of holes in it, and there's billions of dollars that are being paid out and that the IRS is having to chase back at the end of the year because they aren't able to fully verify all these factors that play into how much of a tax credit should an individual receive. Mm-hmm. So I certainly think the Republicans are very motivated mm-hmm. to make sure that in their plan they can showcase, here's how we're going to improve the integrity of that program, and a big part of that will be they need to have reliable reporting to reconcile that at the end of the year.
Yeah, and I think another thing that we look at is that this is a lot of data that we weren't collecting in the same kind of way before, and that data has applicability, application beyond simple reporting. It helps you to know what your employees are covered by, any kind of churn that you have. There are things that can actually help you, so it's not throwaway regardless of where we are with it. And but again, I go to the idea of more complicated reporting. So somewhere between where it is now and something that has a Republican seal of approval as opposed to a Democratic seal of approval, and whether that's whether it will go through, we'll see. We'll see how the bets. We'll keep everybody updated on how the bets work out there. I think that one thing that I wanted to discuss is, and Kristen, you touched upon this a little bit, is what are you advising your customers? What are you telling them in this sort of time of change that's similar to the time of change that we had 7-8 years ago?
Well, I think from our perspective, we're telling them, go full steam ahead. I mean, particularly in the area of consumer-directed benefits and consumer-directed benefit accounts, it's clear that there's a pathway forward for them. And so we're seeing employers move to a greater degree of consumerism. Many employers that maybe had a high deductible health plan as a choice are now moving to that as a full replacement option, and sometimes offering 3 high deductible plans, all that are qualified, but giving the consumers the choice between how much upfront risk they want to handle. So, I think the other thing we say is, keep alert. We'll keep you as informed as fast as we can as to what's going on. But it is a horse race, rat race, and a fun time. I'll tell you, I was in DC last week, and it was very exciting to kind of, if you're a compliance geek kind of person, to be there while the committees are marking up. While they're, I also had the opportunity to go to a fundraiser for Eric Paulson, who's on Ways and Means, and then Chairman Brady, both on Thursday. And Chairman Brady had been up till 4:30 in the morning getting it out of committee, and this was a, maybe 4 o'clock in the afternoon event, and he looked a little worse for wear, So.
Yeah.
And Kristen, you can definitely attest to this. I mean, when I talk to clients and when I give presentations like this, the point of the matter is, even though we're talking about this legislation, this reconciliation process, all this complex stuff, this rat race, this horse race, however you want to refer to it, the bottom line is nothing's happened yet.
Yeah.
And we don't even know if it's gonna happen.
Yep.
So what does that really mean for employers? It means that the law is still the law. These rules are still on the books. So you have to comply unless and until someone like us or others tell you differently. And that is, for example, my message when it comes to talking about this, and I'm sure that you have a similar message.
That's exactly where we are too. And honestly, employers are exhausted by all of this. I feel like so many of our customers, they're almost like, we just got our houses built to get reporting out the door without like a major emotional and physical breakdown in our organization. And right when they got comfortable with those requirements, they have all the data flowing, they've done it, it's year 2. The thought of changing reporting again, I think is just, it's not even attractive or appealing to a lot of the companies out there who just want some stability right now.
You could become apolitical really quickly when you're sort of in the thick of it and you're like, affected by it.
I actually had someone come up to me yesterday afternoon and said, walking into your talk, and it's probably not PC for, she said, it's probably not good for me to stay in this environment, but why doesn't the government just take over the whole thing? Like, wouldn't it, like it's so complex for us as employers.
Right.
And one thing I did say to her, and I think we all need to remember that part of the complexity is our own fault as we've continued to innovate. I mean, imagine a world, times were simpler when we had a major medical policy, period, right? Now we have wellness and EAP and on-site medical clinics and telemedicine, and as much as I love consumer-directed benefit accounts, you have the FSA, the HRA, the HSA, and it is complexity, but it's complexity that's largely been created by innovation in the employer market. We have debit cards, we have IIAS, we have whole industries built around the complexity of the innovation that started in the employer market. And I'm very thankful for that. It has been a great ride and a full career, right?
So let's, in the spirit of what might happen, let's just assume for a moment that something that the AHCA does not get passed for whatever reason. What else might happen? It's not, so the legislative process is one vehicle for change, but it's certainly not the only vehicle. What could happen? What does 2017 look like if the AHCA doesn't pass? You want to start there?
Well, what I wanted to say, and Chris, you probably remember the number, but remember that the Affordable Care Act has 2,000 some places where it says the secretary shall. Okay, that's regulation, and the regulations have kept a lot of us also fully employed, right? I think I called it the Job Security Act, at one point. But remember that all of those, the secretary shall, can now be changed by the new Secretary shall, right? So I think you're going to see, regardless of what happens, you're going to see a bunch of regulations either be pulled back or changed or loosened, in place. However, I know right now there's a moratorium on issuing guidance. We heard that very clearly at IRS and Treasury. And remember, the president's executive order said for every piece of guidance you put out, you have to pull 2 back. So it'll be an interesting world.
Yeah.
And my 2 cents on that is, so if the law does not get enacted and Republicans in Congress fail to repeal the law, basically repeal portions of it, then yes, the administration will act. When it comes to impacting employers, honestly, again, going back to these group health plan requirements, again, covering adult children up to age 26, the no cost sharing for preventive service, I don't really see those getting pulled back. Those will stay in place. Now, the employer mandate, on the other hand, similar to the previous administration, I could very well see the Treasury Department saying, we're not going to enforce it. And there you go. You basically repealed the employer mandate. Reporting requirements, I think, still have to stay in for the same reason that we discussed before. The premium subsidies are going to continue, especially if this law does not, if this bill doesn't get enacted by mid-April. And the IRS needs the reporting requirements or the reporting forms to determine premium subsidy eligibility. So that's going to continue. So really, I think the biggest thing that employers have to be concerned about or be aware of is guidance related to the employer mandate, because to Jody's point, there won't be a lot of guidance in other areas, just for the streamlining regulation kind of policy that the Trump administration has adopted, but also back to the insurance market reforms. I just don't see them going anywhere because there's really not support. It's very difficult to change those. So the employer mandate's really going to be where it's at from an enforcement perspective. I do want to, in the few couple minutes we have, talk about Cadillac tax. So if you'll indulge me, I'll jump in on that. But
just
go ahead.
one minor point. I think you might see some regulatory change in the individual side that's HSA friendly. So for example, we all, on the exchange, there's a millennial plan, right? It's a high deductible health plan that's not HSA qualified because there's 3 office visits. We could very easily see CMS, I could see CMS, putting forth some regulations that says those are all HSA qualified, for example. So I think you'll see that still that Republican policy, and again, I mentioned this yesterday, where in history have you had a president in a joint session of Congress talk about HSAs? I mean, it's kind of a big deal for me, wow, So, but we continue to be very vigilant on the Cadillac tax too. I mean, that's kind of our opening ask.
Yeah, and just quickly on the Cadillac tax, right? So there was a significant effort to repeal the Cadillac tax in this bill that's being considered right now. And as I explained to you, it can't be fully repealed due to the reconciliation rules. But actually, it was going to be fully repealed if this direct limitation that I described to you before, that was a previous draft of this bill, was in place, because essentially Republicans were just kind of replacing the Cadillac tax with this new direct limitation. Well, the direct limitation drops out, so employers are like, yes, woohoo, we accomplished our goal of actually making sure that there's not a new limitation put in, but wow, we didn't really accomplish our goal because we didn't fully repeal the Cadillac tax. Instead, it was just delayed. Expect when this bill gets over in the Senate, there will be discussion for full repeal of the Cadillac tax, which will be done in a form of an amendment, or could be done in a form of an amendment to this reconciliation bill. So I'll just mention that without getting into detail, that you might see an amendment in the Senate first week of April dealing with full repeal of the Cadillac tax. Now, let's say that happens, or let's say it doesn't happen.
Well, let's just say it's politically charged too, because there was a bill that would have repealed the Cadillac tax that went to the President Obama, who vetoed it. When the amendment, it was the Heller amendment, was made to kind of get around the Byrd rule and fully repeal the Cadillac tax, 90 of 100 senators voted to repeal it. So there's going to be a great deal of political pressure to have that happen again on those senators that voted for this virtually the same amendment, a year ago.
Yep. And whether that amendment happens or not, the really top line message that I want to deliver is tax reform's coming up. Tax reform will be considered by Congress at the end of the year. And staff actually specifically, Republican staff specifically communicated this to the employer community, who was happy about getting the direct limitation and dealing with the Cadillac tax in 2025. Staff said, don't be too excited that we didn't have a direct limitation in this bill, because we can't guarantee that we won't revisit it again. And that is, in my opinion, planting the seed that when tax reform comes, there will be another robust discussion about repealing the Cadillac tax, but replacing it with some sort of direct limitation. So employers always need to continue looking over their shoulder as it relates to this whole notion of limiting this tax preference for employer-sponsored insurance, because it's not going away, and it's going to continue to be a fight between the employer community, labor community, and Republican staff, and folks like Speaker Ryan, and even the Democrats who actually believe it's good policy to limit this tax preference. So
and the important thing about that will be mobilizing the workforces, because the real issue there is, remember the 178 million Americans that get their coverage through their employer. If there is a direct cap on the exclusion, it will be a direct tax on those 178 million Americans.
Yeah, I think we reached our quota with talking about the Cadillac tax. I personally don't think the Cadillac tax is ever going to happen, and I think that this is proof, and or the continued delays are proof. But I think that the cap on the exclusion, I've been convinced that the cap on the exclusion is a very wonky but very important thing to talk about. We do want to open it up for questions. I'm going to ask one more question of the panelists, but we do have people with microphones that should be making their way around if anybody has a question. And I just want to ask you guys, you're president for a day. You're president, Speaker of the House, Senate Majority Leader, Supreme Court Justice. You can do whatever you want for healthcare reform. Where do you start?
Stop tweeting.
Okay. Fair.
That's a tough one.
Yeah?
Yeah, and that's a good one. And this is the one question that Shan gave us in advance. And I was like, man, I don't know how I'm going to answer that. And at a very high level, I just think about, there are certain components, and you just mentioned one, the Cadillac tax. There are these somewhat contained portions of healthcare reform that there actually is bipartisan support for. And I just wonder if there was a way to almost force more of a non-political, objective-focused approach to how do we need to change what's out there today in order to kind of get to some of these shared objectives.
Right.
I would try to figure out a way to make the conversation and the process more productive and collaborative, perhaps. Very idealistic.
Yeah.
Yeah, my response is build off the employer-based system. While it has its flaws, it's a market that works. I do think that there does need to be some sort of tax benefit in the individual market, because right now they're not afforded one, or generally speaking, they're not afforded one, or at least pre-ACA they were not afforded one, which is why the premium subsidies came to be a recognition of folks who aren't getting an offer from an employer, need some sort of governmental financial assistance. So you need both of those components. And I'm firmly convinced that the employer-based system, will persevere. It will not be dismantled by the policymakers that are in Washington, D.C. The market's not going in that direction. Employers view offering benefits as an attraction and retention tool, and that's a big, big deal. So irrespective of all the regulations that we just discussed of the ACA, what the future might hold, I'm firmly convinced that even if there's even a direct limitation on the exclusion, that still will not be a death knell for the employer-based system, because employers view that as the attraction and retention, and they will continue to move forward. But build off the employer-based system, help out those people that don't have an employer offer.
I would say collective bargaining for services and coverage for everybody. It would be beautiful if everybody was covered. So that's not really a place to start. That's a place to finish. But do we have questions? Any questions in the crowd right here? We've got a microphone coming around to you.
The GOP put out the bill, and now, you listen to the headlines, and it doesn't seem like they're very unified front on whether or not they actually want to pass this, or, have it fail. Like Senator Tom Cotton's like, this will not pass the Senate. Is it mostly because of the age banding where it's like it's going to hurt older people more, the 3-to-1 to 5-to-1? Is that the main reason? Or just why doesn't it seem like they're unified?
It seems to me that there's that issue, right? And the headlines, I think Chris started out by saying, you kind of can't pay attention to what you read. I mean, CBO came out and said 14 million Americans would lose coverage, right? 14 million Americans
24.
under the new healthcare system are going to choose not to purchase it because they don't have to anymore, right? So it's all about spin. I think the age band issue now, nobody complained when all the younger people had to pay more for the older folks during ACA, so it's kind of an interesting turn there. So yes, older Americans are going to be penalized, is what you're hearing. And I think there is a real concern about the Medicaid issues, and certainly in some states. And I think that's probably the bigger bone of contention. Would you not agree?
Yeah, I would say equalizing, kind of the premium rates and who subsidizes who is going to certainly hurt older Americans, and that is a piece to some of this opposition, but it's not the driver. Really, it's the two drivers are the Medicaid reforms and this new tax credit for health insurance in the individual market. And probably Medicaid reforms being the top sticking point, and this tax credit being the secondary one. And then some of these other issues like hurting older Americans fall a little bit under that, but still a piece. I continue to be convinced, but you never want to be wrong, of course. I'm convinced that conservative Republicans who have been outspoken about this is Obamacare light, this is an entitlement program in the form of the tax credit, we don't even like the Medicaid reforms. I think when they're asked to vote yes or no on repealing the law, that they will vote yes. Now, the real wild card is the expansion state Republican senators who might not like the Medicaid reforms, back to this being the biggest sticking point. And do they support what this bill says? Because they might not care as much about this whole making good on their campaign promise of repealing and replacing Obamacare, because some of them didn't even campaign on that particular issue. The conservatives did, but not the moderate senators in these blue states, which went ahead and expanded under ACA. So that's really where I think all of our eyes should be, is on the Senate and on about maybe 5 senators on whether they're going to vote yes or no.
I think the 5-to-1 ratio is a sleeping giant. The AARP is going to crush them if that goes through. I don't think we've seen the end of that, personally. Next question, anybody? Okay, well, I'll ask you one more question. What do you think, what do you think is the next big move? So the Senate looks at it. What are they looking at? What keeps this going, basically?
Yeah, I feel so bad. I've been talking way too much. I apologize. I could see this getting out of the House, as described, getting over to the Senate, and the Senate basically changing whatever the House passed. And they're going to change it to appease these moderate senators that I described. They're going to do it their way. They're going to vote for it. It's going to pass in the Senate. They're going to send it back to the House. And basically, as you refer to this in D.C., the House is going to get jammed. The House is going to get jammed by the Senate because they're going to pass the bill, they're going to put it over to the House, and they're going to dare the House to vote no on it. And again, going back to my comment about the conservative Republicans, if they voted yes for repeal already, they're not about to vote no on repeal if they get another chance. So I see the Senate changing it, I see it getting back to the House, and I see the House agreeing to whatever the Senate sent them.
And I do think the Senate will pass it because Leader McConnell has already told them that the Senate will not recess for Easter until this is passed.
Yeah.
So,
cut into somebody's vacation time.
and that, believe it or not, that is a huge motivator for, if you look at all the laws that get passed right before recess, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
But there are core components of the act as it stands today that certainly have to be changed in order to get 51 votes in the Senate. So I think we can definitely expect, and that the age versus income eligibility criteria has always been something the House and Senate have been pretty divided on.
Right.
So that, also the defunding of Planned Parenthood, I think is something that has to be addressed in order for that even simple majority to pass. So it'll be interesting to see, how many hours and late nights that requires for the back and forth.
Certainly an important time, though, to be engaged. For those of you who have outside lobbyists or want to be involved in the process, now's the time to kind of hang out in D.C. or at least contact your representatives, because this is an important time.
Yeah, and I think the moral of the story is that going back to what we've discussed previously is that change is ongoing. It's something that even if we were talking right now about President Clinton, there would be things that would be up for change and debate and so forth. Maybe not quite as hurricane-esque as it is right now in relation to healthcare reform, but it's staying the course, as Jody said, full steam ahead. There are issues that are far greater than just compliance that are driving our business. So I want to thank the panelists for being here. I want to thank you for being at One Place. It's really been wonderful to be together with you. And I want to do one more quick plug. Steve Bose, who spoke yesterday, Chris and I sat down with him yesterday for his HR Happy Hour podcast. So go to do a search for HR Happy Hour, and you can hear us talking about some of the things that you've heard us talking about this morning. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your stay here at One Place.